All right, good afternoon or evening, depending on where you're at. My name is Susan Macbeth. I'm the founder and owner of Adventures by the Book. And behind the scenes, joining me is Brooklyn, who will be in the chat box answering any questions you have or providing links available. But we're really excited to have you here today for our Words as Bridges event in honor of National Poetry Month. And we have two esteemed guests that I'm very thrilled are joining us today. We have Samantha S.A. Borders Shoemaker, a renowned poet and conflict resolution specialist, and best-selling author Jeffrey Blunt. We're going to be chatting a little bit about using words as bridges. We're going to bring in the poetry aspect of it. It's going to be really an intimate, unique conversation that I think is really relevant to our times right now. We're living in kind of a world of disconnect, and Jeffrey and I have worked together multiple years on virtual events, in-person events, and we've had many conversations over the years about the power of words, using words as bridges. And we've talked many times about what kind of events we could put together to help encourage people to use words in the best manner possible, because it's so easy in this disconnected world to get riled up and just spit things out without taking the time to think about the power of our words and what they mean. And then when Jeffrey introduced me to Samantha, it was really just providence, I think. They are from the same hometown, a generation apart. So there must be something in the water of that hometown. You guys brings out the talent and in words, but we're glad you're both here. So maybe Jeffrey, you can start by talking a little bit about what brought you to poetry, because we've had conversations in the past about how we weren't big poetry readers and had challenges maybe understanding poetry, and I think it does scare a lot of people off. But you were introduced into it, and tell me your experience.
Well, I was like so many people, not just, I wouldn't say I was scared of poetry, but I just couldn't relate to poetry. It didn't speak to me, and I didn't understand why. And I'm speaking about high school, which was the last time I participated in the reading of poetry, because I disliked it so much. We were reading Keats and Shelley and all these things, and nobody was really explaining it to us. We just were assigned to read these poems. And growing up on a small farm in southeastern Virginia, being African American, there was nothing in these poems that I could relate to. And as far as I could tell, these were the only kind of people who wrote poems. It wasn't until I got into college that Black poets fell into my lap in that situation. But the thing that brought me really here today was Samantha sending me we met a few years back at a literary event, and then she sent me a copy of her of her first book of poetry that was coming out. And I read this, and I thought to myself, wait a minute. In fact, let me see if I can find, I just read it and it spoke to me. So here's just two things. As a writer, I take the broken words from my mouth, crush them under pen, and make a tonic to ease tired souls. And I thought, well, okay, she knows me. This is how I envision myself writing. That's the first step. So that now I can relate to this situation as a writer. And then she said, if words had flavor, mine would be of earth, real and honest, a natural sweet with a little dirt. And I thought, I'm a farmer's son. And all of my words, my growth as a writer comes from that rural space in the earth. So now I found a woman who writes poetry that speaks to me. So now I got to do more. So I read the whole thing. And then the next one comes out. And I do more than read the whole thing. I want to be a part of it. So I read it and then I blurb it because I want people to have the same experience I had. And one of the things that when Samantha and I talked about this before, and I don't want to steal in her thunder, but one of the things I wrote about her book is that she meets you at a place where you are trying to decide who you are. And you're not even prepared for that yet. And that is the amazing thing about poetry. And I just came across Mary Oliver the other day when I was reading about poetry, and she said, poetry is a life-changing force, something as necessary as bread in the pockets of the hungry. That's how I felt when I read Samantha's books. And that's why I recommended that we speak to that. And I want everybody to know who she is and how she writes. And it's very accessible, and it's very personal.
And that's beautiful, Jeffrey. And for those of you out there who have not read poetry and have a fear of it, this is coming from a man who is extremely intelligent. He has 34 years as an Emmy Award winning director. He's been with NBC News for 34 years. He's got best selling books, The Emancipation of Evan Walls, his newest book, Mr. Jimmy Around the Corner. And he's just getting involved in poetry. So it's not too late for any of you. And you hear how powerful of an impact it's made on him. And so I want to hear from Samantha. When you first met Jeffrey and experienced this with him, can you share a little bit about that? And Samantha is also a best-selling author. This is her book, Waiting for Scotland of Poetry, which I encourage you to read. Her poetry is powerful and beautiful. She's a conflict resolution specialist, which we really need right now. So Samantha, share a little bit about your story.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Jeffrey. I'm always so floored and really humble that I get to know you and that we get to have these kinds of conversations. So I met Jeffrey through a mutual friend of ours, also a Smithfield person, Doris Gwaltney, who has since passed. But Doris was someone in the local community who someone gave her my number. I don't know whom to this day. I don't know whom, but someone gave her my number and she had me come to her writing group. And I read her a poem and she said to me, "This is dynamic. This is really something." And she asked if I was serious about it. And I had told her I had published on and off a little bit in anthologies and things like that, but that I was still finding my feet. And she was like, "No, no, 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 no. You must write. You must continue to write." And she was one of many voices, but she was a turning point for me because she gave me the encouragement to actually put it together in a volume of poetry that became the first book that Jeffrey saw, which is Frankenstein the Phoenix. So Doris and I were helping put on this literary conference. She had invited Jeffrey along with Mary Batten, another local author and absolutely stellar writer in her own right. And the two of them just talked him up. And I have to tell you, Jeffrey, I don't even think I've ever admitted this to your face, is that I was so nervous to meet you. And I was like, peasant me, like, what do I even have to offer here? But Jeffrey was super gracious, heard him speak. It was such a powerful talk. And Doris introduced us, but he also got to see me perform a poem at the open mic. The Law of Thermodynamics is what that poem was called. That was actually the piece that Doris took particular notice of. And, she was like, "Y'all really need to talk." And as we talked, and he agreed to look at Frankenstein and the Phoenix, and he gave me such wonderful feedback, and that really helped propel me forward with confidence that perhaps this really was something that was worth pursuing, because I had all these ideas of what I wanted to do with it, but I was like, am I just fluff? Am I just talking to thin air? What is this actually worth at the end of the day? So, meeting Jeffrey was this really awesome turning point for me personally, and he's become an important voice in my life for my own writing. I take what you say very seriously, and that was just such a light bulb moment for me.
Well, he has that effect on people. He and I have had many conversations about this, using words as bridges, but he introduced me to the concept. I had the idea, but the concept of literary activism, which is Actually, I'm going to let you explain it because you can do so much better, Jeffrey. Tell us about literary activism, and maybe you could give us some examples of that.
In the strictest term, in the school terms, it would be the intentional, and the word intentional is meaningful, the intentional use of a narrative, which could be poetry, which could be fiction, which could be nonfiction, to create change in a culture, to assist in issues of social justice. And the most important one of all for me is to push forward the idea of empathy. So that is the distilled essence of what literary activism is. And how we get to all that, every writer who sets out to be a part of this kind of activism is understanding that I'm going to use these words. I've got to the best I can do to make a difference, to make a change. There was a guy, his name was Kendall Haven, and he wrote a book called Story Proof. And in it, he says stories have started feuds that have lasted for generations. Stories have started wars, but they've also forged alliances. They have changed societal and cultural attitudes, belief and values, as well as swayed public opinion. Stories have redefined and refocused the political and social debate. And so that in essence is literary activism. Now, the one I love to talk about the most is The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. Here's a guy who wrote a book, a novel about the horrible conditions in which the meat was being produced or processed in meatpacking plants at the turn of the 20th century. And President Teddy Roosevelt, reads this book. There is a public outcry after reading this book, and it forces Congress and the president to create legislation. And that legislation would eventually become the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. So I always like to say there's one guy who sat in a room by himself, wrote a story that changed the legislative direction of a nation. That's literary activism at its best. You could think of 1984, George Orwell as a warning against totalitarianism. And then I love this one, Beloved. Its most profound impact was to shatter the lingering mythology of antebellum honor and gentility. After Beloved, it became that much more untenable to cling to bloodless arguments about states' rights or to defend the sanctity of Confederate statues. And of course, we've all been watching it, most recently, The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. These are just a few of the examples of books that have changed our society and that have caused us to consider those issues on a really broad and popular level, if I want to say from. So it's not just you and me in a book club having a conversation. We're talking about books that have altered society. Those are the great examples. My books are not Toni Morrison's books, but my books, I seek to, because I believe that activism happens on the grand scale. And I believe that activism happens when you go into school with your child and you sit with a teacher and you explain something about your child that the teacher doesn't know, and it changes how that teacher sees that child and teaches to that child. That's activism. So I'm looking for my books to do change as broadly as possible or with the single person. And activism encompasses all of that.
Agreed. And if you have not picked up any of Jeffrey's books, oh my gosh, you cannot believe the power behind his words. I highly, highly recommend them. And what about you, Samantha, as far as literary activism through poetry? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. It's funny because to me, poetry and activism are very coupled in my mind. And I link it very much to personal experience and the people who inspired me with poetry, many of them actually being activists themselves. So there's a revolutionary touch that one can find in poetry communities, especially with slam poets. If you haven't taken the time to listen to the work of some local slam poets, even, that's a great place to see that intersection where the beauty of words combines with a really powerful message.
Can you explain slam poetry for those who aren't familiar with the term?
Slam poetry is the live performance, and it's not just a reading, it's memorized. There's often choreography with it. It's beautifully done in tandem with multiple people. So it's a very vivid performance. It's also very down to earth. It is not an esoteric form of poetry. It is meant to be for the common person. Communities of color have been really using it as a vehicle to talk about their issues. And it's been fabulous to see how they have used this craft and really pushed it forward as a way to empower themselves and to get their voices out there. So it's quite something. I have a lot of respect for slam poets.
And their
Yeah.
popularity speaks to the power.
Mm-hmm.
They're
Absolutely.
quite popular.
They are. They are. You'll find on social media a lot of people who are not poetry people who will share a piece by a slam poet because they resonate with the message. And for myself, I'm in a liminal space, so to speak. I'm a very much in between writer because it matters deeply to me to be accessible. I don't care to be far away from you. I really want to be a writer who is up close. I talk about it as if I'm holding your hand, sitting next to you, looking at you, and listening and talking. That's more of who I am as a writer. But I also am an academic. I do have extensive knowledge. I do have a lot of pockets to draw from, a lot of life experience. And so I'm somewhere between super accessible, but also layered. So I actually intentionally write my poetry with several different layers. So you can get something from just reading it on the surface. You can get something if you read it again and again and again. But it's meant to invite you in and sit. I don't want it to be thrown out like candy. And with activism, it's funny because the I'd always liked poetry, but the first poem that really grabbed me, I was in a college British literature class and we were looking at the World War I poets. And Wilfred Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est was like he grabbed me from the grave, took me by the collar, and pulled me to his face and said, "You have to listen to me." For those who haven't read that particular poem, it's a scene actually out of his own life. It's a gas attack, and he watches a young man die, and he explicitly describes this scenario and its effects and how it makes him feel. And I didn't think poetry did this. I was like, poetry is fluff and poetry is love and like, feel good. But I was like, this doesn't feel good. I have to sit here and I have to like wash the red spot, to quote Shakespeare, to sit there and rub at it and be like, what is this? And it still sits with me today, the message of that poem. And it's something I often think about in multiple contexts. But that drove me forward into an idea that if I was going to write, it had better mean something. It really needs to be worth hearing and not to add to the chatter and the noise. And I started dabbling a little more seriously in poetry. I actually started writing as a novelist. I was 11 years old and I wrote 3 full-length books that I worked with a professional editor, tried to shop it. I did the old school send the stack of your manuscript to multiple publishers. Like, so again, it's very much a bridge there too. But that didn't work out. And I tried poetry because I was like, well, this is a smaller format, and let's see what happens. And I wrote more in college, and I had a professor pull me aside and say, this is good. This is worth something more than a nominal look at. And it actually ended up winning an award that year and was published in the school literary journal. And I moved overseas to my master's program, and they had a bunch of slam poets, and they pulled me in so quick, so fast into their community. But their words were fire, just absolute engrossing. And I saw the way that they used their words to really get to people. And it got to me, changed me. And I kept thinking, if I write something, it really, really, it's got to mean something. It's got to mean something. And two of my best works actually come out of that era. One just this year is getting published, so I had to wait a long time for that one. But I kept thinking, what am I trying to say? What is it worth hearing? And for me, it was to, as Jeffrey said, build empathy, cut through a lot of the noise and reach a person as they are, not as I want them to be, and to empower them to come to that crossroads of discovery and decide which way to go themselves. But if I can get you there, if I can introduce you to the idea and force your hand and say, you have to make a choice, it's yours to make, but I've brought you there, then I think my work has actually done something. And to me, that's what poetic activism is it's bringing you to a crossroads and says, all right, where are you going from here?
Yeah, and Cindy in our audience said that Ode to a Turret Ball Gunner did the same for her. And so that reminds me is, we'd love to hear from our audience. I'd love to hear from you where you're at in poetry. Are you new to poetry? Have you had a fear of poetry? Are you regularly reading it? We'd love to hear from you. So feel free to type your questions or comments in the chat box or also in the Q&A section in the toolbar at the bottom. And our authors would be happy to answer those. But while we're waiting for those questions or comments, Jeffrey, can you tell me a little bit about what it was about Samantha that you wanted to invite her into this conversation?
Well, I wanted, it was about, the power of her words. I'll just tell you, as I said, I was not particularly interested in poetry, but having found her and read her, I fell in love with it. And I am tasting other works because of that. But I want to tell you that, I put it on the bedside table in our guest room, and with a couple of other books that we just normally leave there. And one is a novel, one is sort of has a lot of news articles or think pieces, that kind of stuff. So I go in and check every now and then after we've had some guests, and guess which one is the only one that's bent back? Is Samantha's. And so I started asking people, and even my son, who's a traveling musician, and he and his band, when they come to DC, sometimes we'll put them up. And so here's some young guys in their late 20s, early 30s, and they come downstairs and we're talking about Samantha's book. Because poetry doesn't look at you like a novel and say, well, I can't read 5 chapters tonight, or if I read the first chapter and I leave and I don't take this book with me, what's the point? Here's something again that is accessible, but also I can tell from, and I would say that these guys, these musicians, are a lot more accessible to their feelings than many men I've met in my life. But to still come down to the breakfast table and to be sitting there, in my mind, having a poetry discussion with some guys in the band is so far from anything that I would have thought about. But there we were. And her book consistently draws that attention in my house. So it's the essence, what you talked about. We're writing for a reason, and it better mean something. I feel the same thing about my work. It better mean something. And I'm feeling that, because as Robert Frost says, if there's no tears in the writer, there are no tears in the reader. There's no excitement in the writer, no excitement in the reader. I'm feeling what she felt when she put that on paper. I'm feeling the conflict, all the relationships, all the crossroads that she's pointing to, and it's making me reflect on myself, which is what I hope my books will do. And so the fact that she was coming from my hometown, the fact that she was touching me in this particular way, and that she was doing it through a medium that I will say I truly dislike, poetry. and now it's totally flipped me. That is activism. Here's you got a guy who's all this time has been working against, I don't have anything to do with poetry. Now all of a sudden I'm reading poetry. I started reading hers, now I'm reading everybody's. But I also wanted to say, she mentioned something about having a professor. I have been asked this question, and I answered it much the same way you did when I was out on tour. Why did you decide that you were worthy of literary activism? Who asked you? And I always say that's a great question, because with fiction, nobody asks you to write fiction. Nobody cares if you don't write fiction. So why do you do it? And I have answered because at some point we have this desire to make a difference, to say something. Somewhere we found out that words are our vehicle to do that. But we still don't do it until somebody tells you, oh, you do have some talent here. So mine came with a professor too. I was a freshman in college, and in my freshman English course, we'd written a couple of papers, and I got an A on the first one. On the second one, I got a note that said, come and see me in my office. So I thought, what's going on? So I go to the office, and long story short, she tells me, you don't belong in the class. You write too well to be in that class. And so what are you doing? What kind of writing are you doing otherwise? I said, well, I'm trying to write my first novel. She said, okay, that's what we're going to do. You're going to come in my office instead of in class, and you're going to write this book. And we're going to talk about how to write a book and all that kind of stuff. But she let me know that I had the power to do something and the power to use my words. And then I felt like, okay, if she believes I can use my words, then I can now say the things I want to say through those words. And that's where my literary activism really was born. I knew I had a lot that I wanted to say. Now someone told me that the vehicle that I was choosing was probably right for me.
And that's a great segue into the next question I want to ask you is, how can you give us some examples, both of you, of how your work has produced change? I mean, I know many of yours, Jeffrey, but I'd love the audience to hear some of your stories, and Samantha, you as well.
I'll start and say that I've written 4 books, and one is a young adult novel called Hating Heidi Foster. And the main character, this is 2 teenage girls, and the main character's father dies saving the life of her best friend. And the book it follows their journey back to friendship, because the main character blames her best friend. She's angry with her dad, and she's going through the process of grief with her mother. Now, I wrote this book about friendship, the power of friendship, and what it means in our lives. And I think I did better than I thought when it came to the issue of grief, because that was getting more and more attention about how it was such a great vehicle to read about and discuss grief. So it was being taught in a high school in Maryland. So they invited me to come and speak to the 9th and 10th grade English classes. So there were about 80 kids there. I go and I speak. Afterwards, I'm signing the books, and a girl comes up to me and she asked me to stand up. I stand up. She said, can I hug you? And I said, yes, not knowing where it came from. And so she didn't just hug me. You get the hug where they turn their heads to the side, press themselves into you, and just hold on. And so I don't know where this is coming from yet. So I just try to match her energy. She backs up and she tells me, my father died 3 weeks before we got the assignment to read this book. And I took it home to my mother, who was struggling, and said, Mom, this is not going to solve everything, but it can give us a way to talk about grief that I hadn't thought about. Will you read this book? And I remember coming home to saying to my wife, to Jean, I don't care if I write another book. This moment is just incredible. And then you mentioned the emancipation of Evan Walls, and I was on NPR, and the next morning I get an email. You don't even have to know what the story is about. Here's a guy who says, I listened to your interview this morning and I almost cried. I was a Black kid that grew up with my brother and mother on the main line in the suburbs in Philadelphia in the 50s and 60s. I'm now 70, and the pain that you described does not go away. I have so much work to do. So you say he has much work to do. So where's the activism there? It's just allowing him to continue to do the work to do and understand he's not alone. this book was about children who were trying to become academically, successful and getting a lot of grief and pain and bullying for it. I stopped at many places where kids would come to me and say, I am Evan Walls. And in one case, it started a friendship, a mentorship that continues today. And that kid who wrote his essay to get into college wrote how the emancipation of Evan Walls helped save him. So again, it's a very small thing. And I've had with the latest book, Mr. Jimmy People, one woman said, and I really just love this. She said, I've never had a fiction, a book, a novel create such a desire to do better in the world with me before. So those are the examples, some of the examples from me. There are others, but I do realize that the books are doing their job, and we're not changing legislation, but we are touching lives and we're getting people to ask questions about themselves or to seek help because of their situation. And that to me is one of the best kinds of literary activism. And also we're getting people, I remember one place I was, a priest stepped up and he said, I want to know, and he just stood up in front of everybody. There's about 500 people there. And he said, I want to know what I can do as a priest to help these children who are going through this. So we had this conversation, and I imagine this man who has a congregation and who has influence has now taken another leap because he read this novel.
Yeah, and I'm glad that priest mentioned that and that you mentioned him, because that's one of the
Mhm.
things we wanted to leave our audience with today is we want you to think about what you can take from this conversation, and little things. They don't have to be huge. And I think that's the point here is we all think we have to, have this grand scale, in front of Congress or the world. But really we can do a call to action that's on a smaller scale, that's not overwhelming. And we're going to ask you about that at the end. So be thinking about that as our authors are talking. So Samantha, what about you?
So my poetry is intensely personal. Now it's designed to be able to reach other people, but it is, if I am honest, quite personal. And that's how it's reached most people. With my first collection, I had a lot of people, in fact, both collections really, but this was the beginning of the phenomenon, is I had a lot of people who would wait for a quiet moment when people weren't looking, and they'd walk over to me and they said, "What you said gave me the power to say it too. I've not known how to say that, or I've not had the courage to say that, but you gave me that power just with this book." And, I've heard that multiple times, especially with Waiting for Scotland. When that got published and people started giving me feedback, my DMs were blowing up with people talking about the language in particular to put to Waiting for Scotland is about family estrangement, about leaving toxic family systems and what that does, that you're not just departing that to try to break a cycle, you're also carrying generations behind you. And you don't get to just be free of that. And a lot of people said to me, I didn't realize I needed this and I didn't understand how to approach it. And I had a family member, and for their privacy, I'm not going to name how close of a family member, but a very close family member approached me and say, you said the things I will never have the courage to say. That it was liberating for this family member to read what I wrote, that even though they can't say it, it was what they needed to hear in order for them to actually go on and heal themselves. Which to me, it's worth everything. It's worth all of the effort, all of the emotional up and down. It's worth it to heal. If I can help you get to that, that's that's all I ever need. That's all I ever want is to be able to help people walk that road.
And
And
oh, I'm sorry.
no, no, just that has been the overwhelming interaction. Now, I've had other pieces in anthologies that started conversations, really important conversations. So I have experience with Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I worked with a Palestinian nonprofit, um, and I wrote a couple of pieces, and they're really just to talk about it, to expose people to it. And they've been key conversation openers of like, what do you mean? What does like what was the experience? And it leads to conversations so that I can point people to say, if you've not encountered this knowledge, here's where to go find it. And if you want to come back as a touchstone, I'm happy to be the touchstone. So many people in my life chose, and I say that very intentionally, they chose to wrestle with me through new knowledge and with challenging myself. And the greatest gift I could possibly that I could give them is to do that for other people. And so whether it's a more overtly political piece or it's something like the predominant part of my poetry to talk about our internal struggles, that's what it's all about.
Well, clearly you're doing that. Some of the comments in the chat room, I'm going to mention a few. Pamela said, poetry and I were on a break until I read Samantha's book. So high praise indeed. Michelle wrote, I am a beginner. Any suggestions for rhyming poet or metered poet that is modern? And Cindy answered that. You might start with Robert Frost. Marilyn Martin Mark wrote, in 2010, my daughter's first year at college, somehow a parents group formed a subgroup of poetry. We exchanged poems every Friday. This group continued for many years and introduced me to so many poets. Amanda Gorman blew my mind and most of the country in 2021. There are fabulous slam poetry groups online. I look forward to reading Samantha's poems. So, and then Lori also said it's a beautiful book. And I think for many people, you named things that they didn't know were unnamed. So, nice praise indeed, which leads to my next question is, what hopes do you both have for literature or poetry, specifically your works, to make a difference, especially in today's world?
I have great hopes for it. I keep, and this conversation right here is an example of that. I just recently, I think when I first put on Facebook that we were going to be having this conversation, I started the conversation by saying, and when things are happening like they are today, it makes you wonder, why should I keep writing? How am I gonna make a difference writing my little book and that sort of thing? But when you realize that, in many ways, I remember my father talking to me about growing up on a farm and being in our farm community and understanding that people are just trying to get through the day here. They can't think about Washington. They can't think about this. They're just trying to get through the day here. And so if there are ways to reach people through stories, I knew a lot of people who read when I was growing up through poetry, as we're stepping in that direction here tonight. I just want to be able to touch them, and I think that these words are possible to do that. And if people are wondering how it can be done, I'm thinking now, just occurred to me, Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, where someone can sit and write something from the heart and so meaningful that it reverberates for generations, and it changes minds and opens hearts for generations. So I'm hopeful that as people continue to write, and whether it's nonfiction or fiction or just articles that can make people question who we are and where we are and what we're doing, and question ourselves and our political structure, whatever. And I think it all makes us better people. And the more we read books and things that make us more empathetic, is a great thing. Russell Banks, the author Russell Banks, talked about how a novel is uniquely structured to reach us in ways that other literature or things can't, because you can be in the shoes of a person in a novel in a way that you can never be in some other meetings. Like, you can watch a movie, you can see that person act, you can hear them speak, you can see the situation around them, but you really don't know what they're thinking, what they feel about themselves unless they say it. In a novel, you know all of that, and you learn about that person. You walk in their shoes in a way that you probably can't in any other medium. We know from study after study after study that fiction creates empathy in a way that nonfiction does not. Nonfiction can, but empathy from fiction is greater because you're putting yourself in those situations. And as we heard from Mary Oliver, poetry does the same thing. So I'm hopeful and I believe that the more we read, the more we are sharing these incredible pieces that we see on social media, a clip from a quote from Toni Morrison here, or a quote from Langston Hughes there, and it adds to, I think, the proper conversation. It makes us question who we are. And we should all be doing that. It's one of the things we taught our children to do. And Marilyn Martin Mark, who you just mentioned, is a good friend of mine, and my daughter and her daughters are longtime friends. And we know that we all taught our kids here in our community to question authority and to read and learn. So I'm hopeful that my books will continue to do that.
Yeah, and Pamela just mentioned she just ordered Almost Snow White and the Emancipation of Evan Walls, and looking forward to reading them. You're going to be blown
Thank
away,
you.
Pamela. I can share that. And also, it's interesting that I just now thought about this, that I've been thinking about this a lot longer than I thought I have, because about 20 years ago, when I wrote my master's thesis, I wrote it on the historicity of fiction in
Mm,
Holocaust
Mhm.
literature, because
mm.
the premise is that you can learn more about the history and what people actually went through by the fictionalized version rather than our nonfiction texts.
Yeah.
So I guess I've been thinking about it a lot longer than I thought I had. Samantha, what about you?
What I hope for poetry is that it uses itself to draw people in. So poetry is a very intense and immediate medium as part of its efficacy, its ability to make changes, because it is so close and it's intense, it's bite-sized, and it distills an experience. I want to pull up a quote by Alice Walker that I have here, because even though she's talking about writers and actually people in general, I think that this is actually the goal for the future of poetry, should we choose to embrace it. What makes a really great person? Someone who goes to find where the silence is and tries to understand why the silence is there. She talks about in this clip the power of a good listener, that the most extraordinary writers, the most extraordinary people are people who sit and they listen and they try to give voice to where people feel they can't talk. And I think if we are able with poetry to start immersing people in the experience of the other, whatever other that is, because everybody has, to some level or another, a type of person that it's hard to relate to, and in some cases, refuse to relate to. So, poetry allows a really, really close look at this other person who has a vastly different experience. And I think that if we are to really affect change in the way that poets write, we should focus on that particular instance of encounter not just me, but yourself. Poetry very much is a mirror. You can see me, the poet, in the mirror, but it's really you when you read my work. You're really looking at yourself in the way that you interpret it.
And I say I love the Alice Walker quote. That was fantastic. And it just made me think of Richard Wright from Black Boy, which was my Bible when I was a kid. It was a book that taught me that I could be changed by a book. And in it, he wrote about why he wrote. And it's sort of like Alice Walker when he said, I would hurl words into this darkness and wait for an echo. And if an echo sounded, no matter how faintly, I would send other words to tell, to march, to fight, to create a sense of hunger for life that gnaws in us all, to keep alive in our hearts a sense of the inexpressibly human. And that is why I write. And that is why I feel like my job is to use my words to make a difference in the world.
That's so beautiful. Yeah. And I know
It
you've mentioned
is.
right many times. I know
Yeah.
you're a huge fan, and I encourage people to read him as well. And Brooklyn, maybe you can type in the chat box some information about how people can follow Samantha and Jeffrey and get more information about them. I know we're running out of time, but I mentioned earlier in the program that we really want this to be something that sticks with you, that you think about and process, and maybe do something, no matter how small. And that's what Jeffrey talked about. What Richard Wright talked about is making just a little difference. You don't have to do something major. And I think that stops a lot of people. They think, well, what difference can I make, my little voice? And actually, when I started Adventures by the Book 15 years ago, my idea was the same, is that there's so much going on in the world. I'm not a super influencer, I'm not a politician, I'm not a
Right.
celebrity, but I believe in the power of books and words to connect people and communities. And I'm going to find one little way in my little corner of the world that I can effect change by connecting people over the power of words. And that's what we're talking about today. So what I
Yeah.
want to close with is a call to action and asking our audience members. And maybe Jeffrey and Samantha, you could share what your call to action would be for them. And Samantha, maybe you could even read a poem before, after, that speaks to that a little bit.
Yeah.
So
Go
anybody want
ahead.
to, Samantha?
Here, I'll go for it. My encouragement to everybody who's been here tonight is would I think it would be transformative for you to read 3 different poets with 3 different poems that seem on the surface to be someone beyond yourself. Whether it's because you disagree with them or it's just not a reality that you've lived, we will be sending out a list that I've recommended. So I've recommended 3 pieces. I've recommended the one that transformed me, Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen, Washing My Mother's Body by Joy Harjo. That is especially poignant to me across culture and across time, because I just lost my mother recently. And the piece, I actually encountered it several years ago before my mother ever died. And I remembered thinking, I dread this moment, but I had even then courage to face it. And when she passed, I thought of this poem, and I've been revisiting it myself, and it has some incredible imagery. But I really encourage you. She's a Muskogee writer, and she was the poet laureate of the United States. So she's an incredible writer. So that's Joy Harjo. And then the last is Identity Card by Mahmoud Darwish, and he was the Palestinian poet laureate. And Identity Card got a lot of attention because it came from a very raw place. So regardless of how one feels about the conflict, it's a seminal piece about the experience of being Arab, of being Palestinian. And that is I expect that at least some of these poems will make you uncomfortable. And when you encounter discomfort, I want you to stop and ask yourself, what is it that is actually, am I reacting to? And I'm using my conflict hat. What am I reacting to? Who, if I do my best, who is this person really? The character in the poem or the actual author? And if I sat down with them and had them talk to me honestly, what is it that they're actually trying to say to me? Really allow yourself to lean into it and take that discomfort and just sit. Doesn't have to change your mind, but I really hope it helps you encounter something different. And that would be my challenge to you, is encounter something new, whether it's uncomfortable or simply foreign.
Beautiful. And so for those of you who didn't get the
Very
name,
nice.
We are going to send a thank you e-blast out after the event, either tonight or tomorrow morning, and we'll include those names in there so that you can look them up, as well as links to Jeffrey and Samantha. And thanks for putting those in the chat box, Brooklyn. Jeffrey.
Samantha, that was great. I think that I believe in the uncomfortable situation too, and making yourself uncomfortable, because that's how we grow. So my challenge for people is to, I spent 34 years at NBC News, and while I am a novelist now, I write about issues that come out of my time there, and it is still a part of me. And so we are in a troubled world and a troubled time for our country. And given that Toni Morrison says this is the time for people for writers to write, for artists to do art, to make a difference, I challenge you to make yourself uncomfortable, to think about a particular issue that is happening. I know there are many to choose from right now, and to read something from both sides, whether you think it's silly or crazy or whatever, because no matter what, it helps you put yourself and your life in context. So aside from assigning you a novel, I would say that, give yourself this weekend, pick an issue, look online, read about that issue, and a couple of hopefully thoughtful op-ed pieces about that issue, and then question how you have grown or not have grown from that. So that it comes out of my news background, but I do know why people write op-ed pieces. I have several op-ed pieces written too, and they're written with the same mission, to make you think. You don't always have to agree with what I've written, but did you think about the issue? Did you think about this other side? So that would be my challenge to you, to find some articles, read them, and think deeply about who you are in relation to them.
Thank you both. And we're going to put these in our thank you e-blast so you can think about it. But we're really encouraging you to just take that small step, what Samantha suggested or Jeffrey suggested, or create your own, and, do something that challenges you. And then send us an email and tell us what that process was like for you. If something Jeffrey said or Samantha said inspired you, something you read inspired you, we want to hear about it, because this is why we all do what we do. And we think this could catch on and make a difference bigger than politics ever can.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm a Pollyanna, I don't know. But Marilyn wrote, in my mind, Jeffrey's words move readers with his understanding of human nature, moving readers with his empathy. Poetry can stab you in the heart with the shock of truth. This conversation is fabulous. Thank you all. Daniel wrote, words connect people and communities. Cindy, this has been a powerful event. Thank you, all of you. So with that, I think our time is up, but any final thoughts or words? Samantha, did you want to read a piece? Jeffrey, do you want to read anything? Do you guys want to have any final words?
No, I think I'll let Samantha take us out, except to say that what you just said, I don't know if you meant that to be your call to action, but I think it's beautiful for people to sit down and write about something that's on your heart and see what comes out. And write it with the intention of whether you do it or not, write it with the intention of you're going to give it to people, that you were trying to change some minds, and see what comes out of you. That's a beautiful thing, Susan.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Thank you for summing that up much more eloquently than I could.
So I was going to read one, but I think I've got the right. I'm changing my poem last minute because I think I've got the one that hits the right note. But first, before I do that, because I think it's a great way to close, is I want to thank you, Susan, and thank you, Jeffrey, so much first for inviting me into this conversation and giving me a space to engage with you both. This has been fabulous and an absolute delight. And thank you so much to everybody who showed up and who's going to dive in and do the work. It's thrilling. It's terrifying. Do it. You won't be sorry. All right. There is a place where rest can be found, cool and quiet as the river of peace and solitude, where one day, maybe, Wandering souls will see their paths in the water's reflection. This is my writer's benison to you.
Wow.
I'm telling you,
I felt that breath of release as you read that.
she's so
Beautiful.
good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well,
So much.
as Samantha said, we want to thank our audience for participating, and our authors and our poet, Samantha and Jeffrey. You guys are incredible. Your words are powerful, have so much meaning and call to action behind them. We are going to send that email out. So we really want to hear from you. What are you doing? What are you reading? What are you thinking in response to this conversation? And I hope that we can come back another time and have a follow up. So thank you all and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so
Good night,
much.
everyone.
Good night,
Good night.
everyone.